Okay, let us begin. Welcome everyone. Thanks very much for coming to this session. My name is Peter Knight and I'm part of the Centre for Digital Trust and Society, and I'm a professor in the American Studies Department. A couple of housekeeping things to begin with. Toilets are sort of out in the lobby around the corner there. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if the fire alarm does go off, follow Kitty and others and we'll meet you outside. And the other thing to note is that the session is being recorded, and there might be some photos as well, so if anyone has any problems with that, speak to Kitty and we can sort that out. What's down there? So, as you probably know, the Centre for Digital Trust and Society is part of the Digital Futures programme at the university, which is this kind of university-wide coming together of nearly 1,700 academics interested in the kind of broad territory of digitality and what that might mean in all kinds of different realms. In particular, the Centre for Digital Trust and Security brings together people working in more technical areas like cybersecurity with other people in the humanities and sciences like myself. And it's organised in terms of kind of 6 and now about to be 7 themes, which you can see here. And the 7th theme, just about to be formed, is on AI. So, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Vaccari from the University of Edinburgh. Cristian is Chair of Future Governance, Public Policy and Technology at Edinburgh, and he directs the Master's Programme in Future Governance at the marvellous building and institute called the Edinburgh Futures Institute. And he was previously Director of the Centre for Research in Communication and Culture at Loughborough. Cristian's also served as co-rapporteur for 2 committees of experts of the Council of Europe, first on freedom of expression and digital technologies, and then on a second commission on the integrity of online information. And Cristian's research is broadly in the area of political communication by elites and citizens in comparative perspective, with a particular focus on digital and social media. His most recent book from OUP is called Outside the Bubble, Social Media and Political Participation in Comparative Perspective. And that book won the Best Book Award from the American Political Science Association in the relevant section. So, join me in welcoming Cristian to deliver a talk today on source credibility as a double-edged sword.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Kitty, for impeccable organization, and thanks to everyone else who has made this event possible, and to all of you for coming. I'm really excited to present this piece of research today. Partly because, as I was telling Peter, these are the kinds of papers you present at international conferences and you have 10 minutes and you have to cram everything into 10 minutes. And it's going to be so nice to be able to finally explain where this project is coming from and our findings in a more relaxed rhythm, and with the ability of providing more information and have more interesting discussions. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Professor Andrew Chadwick from Loughborough University, Dr. Natalie Ann Hall, who is now at Cardiff, and Dr. Brendan Lawson, who is at Loughborough. We were partners in a grant funded by the Leverhulme Trust, in which we adopted a multi-method approach to understand the dynamics of the sharing of information and misinformation on private messaging apps. So when we devised this grant application, we had in mind some what we thought were gaps and inconsistencies in research on misinformation, and in general in research on digital media and politics. Most of that research doesn't take into account, in my opinion, the fact that most of what people do on the internet is now happening on smartphones. devices that we bring with us, that we use while we're waiting at the queue to get coffee, while we are bored, while watching a TV program we don't care about, devices that don't have the same levels of focus and intentionality as computers, but also devices that accompany us in our everyday life and become tools for communication, not just tools for information retrieval or information provision. And sometimes scholars forget that most of what people do on the internet doesn't have a lot to do with news, doesn't have a lot to do with gathering information from sources, has mainly to do with talking to other people. And one key platform or set of platforms through which people talk to other people online are personal messaging apps. Now, personal messaging apps are WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Telegram, Signal, Snapchat. These are all apps that have their own specificities and affordances, but all entail encrypted communication with individuals or groups that could go from small to medium to very, very large, depending on platform rules. Now, these apps have come under scrutiny in the last few years because of the risk of them hosting and spreading large amounts of misinformation. The literature on misinformation started by looking mainly at public social media or semi-public social media like Facebook and Twitter, where we know what happens more or less in terms of the spread of information and misinformation. But initially, these messaging apps were largely ignored, partly because there's no big data from them. It's encrypted communication with very few exceptions. It cannot easily be downloaded, and the activities that matter the most on these apps, I would argue, are the ones in one-on-one or small group conversations that are not public and cannot be obtained safely and ethically by researchers. However, these are very important apps that we need to understand better. WhatsApp alone has more than 2 billion users globally. Other platforms are also very popular and very important. In Britain, 79% of internet users are also WhatsApp users. So essentially everyone who is on the internet has either WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or one of these platforms through which we communicate with other people. In many countries, if you look at data about the popularity of different platforms, personal messaging apps have more users than the social media, like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok that everybody talks about. We argue, and this is the key motivation of the project, that these platforms have particular and very complex features that are relevant to the sharing, spreading, and believing in misinformation. And this is what we try to understand with this project. We call these platforms hybrid public interpersonal communication contexts. What does that mean in practice? It means that on these apps, we constantly combine and switch between personal conversations, talking to your parents, to your partner, to your children, to your family, but also communication that has broader public relevance. You might be part of a group where news is discussed. You might be part of a group where people talk about meeting up for football, but as part of the group, somebody shares some news, somebody shares some updates that, or even just a joke or a funny meme that could lead to a political or news-related conversation. We've all had the feeling of, going to a big family dinner for Christmas, and then somebody making an awkward comment about politics, and then either everybody gets engaged or everybody detaches. Well, the same things happen on these channels, especially the ones that have to do with our families and friends. And so people transition constantly from these public and private messages and public and private contents, and so does misinformation. Now, we reason that these platforms have at least 7 key affordances. And affordance is a term typically used in the study of computer-mediated communication that entails the uses that a tool, a platform, encourages. And these uses are not just inscribed in the technology, they depend on the social adoption of that technology. So if people start using a technology in a certain way, that becomes an affordance of that technology because everyone else expects to do the same. So the key ones to us are, first of all, these are platforms for intimate communication, right? You talk on these platforms with people you care about, strong ties, as sociologists call them, people that you spend a lot of time interacting with, and therefore, these are not relationships you want to throw away with the bathwater. These are not relationships that you want to jeopardize because you start arguing about misinformation or politics. These are important relationships in your life. It's very easy to forward information on these apps, and so it can travel very quickly. And as a result, there is a strong potential for virality on these platforms. Information can go very quick, very far, very fast. However, it's very difficult for researchers to establish what goes viral on these platforms because we don't have the data. An important element is that very often we don't know where the content that is being shared comes from. If somebody shares a link to a website, of course, that link is there and you can click on it. But if somebody just shares a screenshot or copies and pastes a headline or says, oh, I've just heard that this has happened, we don't know what the source is. We cannot check what the source is. That has implications, of course, for the spread of misinformation. There are hazy audiences, we call them, meaning that, yes, when we're talking to our fiancé, our children, our parents, we know who we're talking to. But what if we get added to a group that is the group that someone is creating to coordinate a birthday party that you're invited to? Who's in that group? Well, you could look at the list, but you will not really look at the list and pay attention to who's in that group. So it might be that as you discuss things in that group, you end up talking to people you don't know. You end up talking to people you don't know are there listening and participating in the conversation because the affordances of the platforms are to facilitate these informal conversations without clearly lining up and calling all the names of the people who are there. These platforms are not searchable. You cannot just search on the platform for everything that everyone has said. You can only search for the content in a particular chat or a particular group. That means that if somebody shares some misinformation with you, you cannot search and doesn't tell you where it comes from, you cannot search and find out where it comes from. You can search on Google and see if you can find it, but you cannot search inside the platform itself. And finally, and perhaps most obviously, because of end-to-end encryption, there is no content moderation, really. We know, I'm sure everybody knows, that the social media platforms, up until a couple of weeks ago, would tell us that they did care about content moderation, they did care about limiting the spread of misinformation, they did care about hate speech, they were trying their best. When they were not doing so well, it was against their best wishes. Now they're telling us they care about free speech because someone else is in the White House. Fine, but up until a couple of weeks ago, and I still think that difference is meaningful, there was and is a difference between platforms that at least have the possibility to automatically moderate, prioritize, deprioritize, demonetize at scale the content that we see in there, the public social media platforms that do not share encrypted communication, and the platforms like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, etc., that because of encryption, even if they wanted to, cannot moderate content for us. So there are a few things that WhatsApp will do to limit the spread of misinformation, or at least to add some warnings. We did some work as part of this project on the infamous, forwarded many times tags on WhatsApp. But really, if somebody shares misinformation with you, or hate speech, or something really horrible, you will see it, right? The platform cannot take it down. That's because of the inherent way the technology works. So these are all affordances that we think are relevant to the spread of misinformation on these platforms. Now, the topic I want to talk about today in the context of personal messaging apps is what we call deceptive source misattribution. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it entails taking a piece of information that is false, exaggerated, fabricated, taken out of context, and attributing it to a reputable source that has never published that piece of information. I know there's people here in the room that study cybersecurity, misinformation. These are rather common techniques these days. They've always been used in a way, but we argue that the internet and particularly messaging apps enable these techniques to be used more effectively. If you want to convince people of false information, you could put together a very big website or a plausible-looking social media account that shares some true content, some false content, and try to fool people that way. We know this happens, of course. The infamous Denver Guardian in 2016, which wrote that the Pope endorsed Trump. That was mainly economically motivated misinformation. They were just trying to sell ads. We know that there are social media accounts that pose as legitimate news sources, but they're not. Well, those require a lot of time and effort to be maintained. Whereas just sticking as we will do in our experiment, just sticking the logo of a prestigious news organization next to a headline that says something that never happened is very quick and easy, and can be done very easily on messaging apps for the reasons I've just discussed. Now, we know these tools are used by both organized actors and individuals. A few months ago, we learned about the doppelganger operation by the Russian misinformation agencies. What they do chiefly is they build clones of media websites and clones of government websites, among other things, which look like the original ones. They buy URLs that look like the URLs of the original websites, and then they populate these websites with misinformation, particularly about Ukraine. This is obviously cumbersome and done at large scale, but we also know about individual acts that are much easier to perform. For a year or so now, we've had the pleasure here in Britain to have Elon Musk get an interest in our politics, which obviously we really needed. There wasn't enough people interested in British politics. One of the first performances he pleased us with was to comment, retweet, quote tweet a tweet by a leader of the British far right, which was posting a screenshot of a headline that was formatted as if it was published by the Daily Telegraph. And this headline was also attributed to a Daily Telegraph journalist. It said that Keir Starmer was considering deporting people who had been arrested during the Southport race riots in the summer to somewhere in the Falklands, and they would call them concentration camps, detainment camps, sorry. Elon Musk thought this was very important and his followers needed to know, so he quote tweeted that. Problem is, this article never existed, this fact never existed. The journalist at the Daily Telegraph does exist, but he never wrote that article. He had to write an article saying, I never wrote that article, and the Daily Telegraph had to issue an official denial. We might think these are isolated facts, but they are not. Just by looking at Full Fact, one of the main fact checkers in the UK, and just looking for fact checks related to the BBC, you find all sorts of false claims that somebody at some point has attributed to the BBC by either creating social media accounts that resemble them or just spreading false screenshots of BBC headlines that are not BBC headlines on topics that range from sports to foreign policy to the war in Ukraine. And so there is a lot of evidence out there that this idea that you can deceptively attribute false information to a reputable source is actually something that organizations and individuals are quite keen on doing. Now, why would that matter? Why would this technique be effective? Well, in communication research, we have known for decades that sources matter, right? So normally there are different ways in which people attribute credibility, different objects to which people attribute credibility. One is the message. Do we believe in the content of that message? Do we believe that the Pope endorsed Trump in 2016? The other is thinking about the qualities of the communicator. Who is telling us what they're telling us? And how does the identity and the qualities we recognize in the person communicating to us affect our understanding and belief in the message? Do we believe something more because someone we believe in told us? Yes, we do. Research shows us that this is very strongly the case. Source cues are particularly important in contemporary media environments. we are constantly bombarded or scrolling through large quantities of content. We have very little time to process it, and we very often don't have the inclination to spend a lot of energy and effort processing that content. So what do? We rely on what psychologists call heuristics. These are very quick and easy ways in which we make decisions with limited amounts of information. Sources, the credibility of a source, is a very important and powerful cue through which people make these kinds of decisions, especially when they're engaging in what Kahneman and Tversky called system one thinking. This is the quick and easy and low effort kind of thinking that we do all the time when we need to make a quick decision and we don't have the time or the energy or the inclination to focus and spend a lot of time deliberately thinking about what is the best course of action. Sources are less important when we, and other cues and heuristics are less important when we are much more deliberate in our thinking. We engage in what Kahneman and Tversky call system two kind of thinking, but that's not what happens when we're scrolling on our phones. That's not what happens when we are on WhatsApp and some of our friends share a funny meme. That's not what happens when we are, cooking while checking our phone while we wait for, the water to boil. And so heuristics are very important. Credibility heuristics have been known for decades to influence how people assess the credibility of the message. Now, news organizations are very important sources in contemporary media environments, even though, of course, the world is much more complex and there are a lot more sources than traditional news organizations. However, we know from experimental research that reputable news organizations tend to be seen as more credible, and the messages attributed to them are believed much more by people than messages attributed, for example, to friends, or messages attributed to fictitious imaginary sources, or messages attributed to alternative media. Now, sources come in different shapes and sizes. Here in the UK, according to the Reuters digital news report, the BBC is the most trusted source of news in the UK, and then there is, a few others going all the way down to the Sun, which among the 15 that they studied is the least trusted source. So if one attributes information to a reputable news organization like BBC News, it is likely that a lot of people will believe it. There are two challenges to this point, however. One is that in contemporary media environments, it is true that people still recognize the authority of journalistic organizations. It's also true that people, because are exposed to so much information in a constant flow, they tend to forget what the source was, or they tend to even not pay attention to what the source was. We know from research on cognition that people often don't pay attention to these kinds of information. Oh, what happened here? This screen got off. Oh. Did I do it? Yay. Thank you, Kitty. So we know that people sometimes forget or don't pay enough attention to these cues, even though they're useful to them. There's just too much information. They just focus on something else and move on, and they cannot recall. And number two, as I mentioned earlier, in a very fluid, complex environment where signals of where something comes from are not always clear, people can simply maliciously misattribute inaccurate information to reliable sources. So, to summarize, our background considerations, the motivation for this project is that personal messaging has distinctive affordances that make it a potentially complex and ripe environment for disinformation. Number two, this is even more important when it is not possible to automatically moderate this content at scale on messaging apps, which, by the way, means that the only defense against users seeing and believing misinformation on these apps are other users. If you see in your family group somebody sharing information you believe is not true, you are and you think you're the only person who knows this, you have a choice to make. You're either going to challenge it and risk the relationships involved in that group, risk jeopardizing them, or you're going to let it go because those relationships are more important to you, you've got bigger fish to fry, you need to put your kids to bed, or something else. But user behavior is central because there is nothing else that we can hope is going to limit the spread of misinformation, which is not the case on public social media, at least technically. As I mentioned, source credibility is a very powerful heuristic. We know that people rely on it to decide whether they believe a message is credible. We also know from research on misinformation that generally speaking, most people do a decent job at identifying truth versus from falsehood, right? So if you look at research that asks people to tell whether something is true or not, and they usually give people headlines that are derived from the news and from misinformation sharing being circulated at a time in a given country, people usually get it right more than they get it wrong. However, what happens when they are seeing misinformation attributed to authoritative sources? Does that limit their ability to discern? And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, these techniques, deceptive source misattribution, is used quite often in contemporary media environments and can be particularly powerful and poisonous on personal messaging. So, based on this reasoning, we have hypotheses on three different hypotheses which focus on three independent variables. I'll talk about the dependent variables in a minute. So, we believe that if people, that three factors should be important here. That news is attributed to a reputable news organization. Secondly, we believe that people will react differently to true versus false news. And thirdly, we are interested in the interaction between these two factors. So, do people react more strongly to false news if they see false news attributed to a reputable news organization compared to true news attributed to a reputable news organization? What difference does that make, not only to whether people believe anything, but to whether people believe true information more than they believe false information, which is what we would hope should happen. Now, let's talk a little bit about our dependent variables. And I hope you'll understand in a minute why I'm splitting this presentation between these two. So, as I was mentioning earlier, this was a 3-year multi-method project where we didn't just do experiments, which is what I'm going to talk about in a minute, but we also spent a lot of time talking to people. We did 102 interviews with members of the public, which then we re-interviewed almost 80% of them 6 months later to really understand how they use these apps, how they perceive misinformation, how they protect themselves against it, and how they deal with it when they see it shared by other people or when they end up sharing that perhaps by mistake. We published some papers about these topics, and we built on these papers to try and come up with a more nuanced categorization of the key outcomes of exposure to misinformation on personal messaging. Now, if you spend some time reading the literature on misinformation these days, and you focus on what outcomes are they studying, what is it that they care about, that people do or do not do, they normally look at three kinds of outcomes. Number one, are people good at differentiating, at estimating whether something is true or false, right? This is the baseline. Do people believe in falsehoods but more than they believe or less than they believe in truth? It is very important, by the way, to look at both true and false beliefs, because it might be that you run a survey, you run an experiment, and you find that you show people only false information, right? And you ask them, do you think this is true or not? And they all tell you, no, this is false. You're like, great, my participants are really discerning. But if you only show them false information, it might be that they're not discerning, they're just skeptical or cynical. They don't believe in anything. By the same token, if you only show them true information and they all tell you, oh yeah, this is true, they might not be discerning. They might just be, credulous. They might just trust you as a researcher in showing them accurate information. So you really need to look at both. The second kind of outcome that most research looks at is, are people going to share that information? Of course, very important in contemporary environments. And the third outcome most researchers have looked at is, verifying information, like are you going to fact check it, are you going to ask around, are you going to do something to establish whether this is true or not. Now these are really important outcomes and we focus on them in this project, we measure them and constitute some of our dependent variables. However, because of the considerations I mentioned earlier, we also believe we need to expand the range of outcomes we study when we look specifically at personal messaging. Because personal messaging is not just a place where you post information or check it, it's also a place where you discuss it, it's also a place where silence can also be meaningful, right? As I was saying earlier, if somebody in your family group shares some information you believe to be false, a lot of people we find in our research know this and decide to let it go. Why? Because their friendship, their good relationships with their spouse's family are more important than adjudicating, how big the NHS waiting lists currently are. So, one outcome that we include in our measures is people staying silent as a result of seeing information. But as I mentioned earlier, messaging apps are dialogic. They are places where people have conversations. So we also measure, include, and conceptualize whether people would ask for additional information or try to provide additional information themselves. Right? So these 6 outcomes here, 3 that are largely derived from existing research, and 3 that we, I think for the first time, measured and conceptualized with respect to personal messaging are what we are interested in here. And so to complete the picture that I started showing you before, we have 3 independent variables, each of which is the center of one of our hypotheses, and then we have 6 dependent variables. And even though these are all sort of like bundles of activities that could be or scenarios that could fall under these labels, we believe that the first 3 here, whether people believe that a message is accurate, whether people are likely to share or forward it, and whether people are likely to stay put and not challenge the message, these outcomes mean that any message, true or false, will either not be challenged or circulate further, right? So if the message is false and people stay silent, the likelihood that that message will spread further and influence other people will increase. By contrast, the last 3 outcomes, asking for additional information, providing additional information, and verifying the accuracy of the message, they have a greater chance of stopping the propagation of information, whether it be true or false, or at least starting a conversation about it that might lead to it being contextualized. So, in principle, if information is false, this keeps coming off. In principle, if information is false, from a normative standpoint, we would like to see the outcomes in green go up. The outcomes in red go up, and the outcomes in green go down, and vice versa for true information, right? We would like to see people stay silent, share it, and think it's accurate if it's true, and we wouldn't necessarily want people to inquire in it, and we wouldn't even want them to, spend a lot of time verifying it because it's true. So we're interested in seeing whether a message is attributed to a reputable news source, whether a message is true or false, and the interaction between these two affect these 6 outcomes. Now, how do we test this? How do we test these hypotheses? We ran an experiment embedded in an online survey. We recruited more than 2,500 UK participants who resembled the general online population based on a number of demographic characteristics and were users of WhatsApp because, as you will see in a moment, the experiments simulated the environment in WhatsApp. We had a pretty decent participation rate. We fielded the survey right after the British local elections in 2023. And after a few demographic questions and questions measuring attitudes, participants were randomly assigned to seeing brief vignettes. A vignette is a short text that asks people to imagine a certain scenario. And these vignettes included realistic mock-ups of the WhatsApp interface with certain content that I will discuss in a minute. Then we measured, after exposure to these treatments, our 6 dependent variables, and then we debriefed participants, telling them clearly why we showed them what we showed them, and when we showed them information that was inaccurate, pointing them to reliable, reputable fact-check websites that would clarify that the information was inaccurate. So our experimental design is a between subjects full factorial experiment. This essentially means that every person only saw one variation of all of our treatments, and we had different categories, and we showed treatments for all these categories across all participants. So if you were taking our survey, after those initial questions, you would be randomly assigned to seeing one of these vignettes with realistic mock-ups, and these vignettes and mock-ups could vary in 5 different ways. The 2 ways we're going to talk about today are, unsurprisingly I think at this point, whether they contained true or false information, and number 2, whether that information, true or false, was attributed to the BBC News, the most reliable and the most reputable and trusted news organization in the UK, or to no source at all. We had other sources of variation in these treatments. One was the topic. Scholars studying misinformation try to include at least more than one topic because it might be that just the topic is influencing responses rather than your experiment, rather than your treatments. So in this case, we had 2 topics. One was climate change, and the other was the voter ID legislation that had just come into effect for the elections in that year. These messages could be seen as coming from a family member, a friend, or an acquaintance, and they were shown as being posted as part of one-to-one conversations, as part of a small group of up to 5 people, or as part of a large group of more than 10 people. Now, the topic is not a factor of interest to us. We just have it so that we have a little bit more certainty that our results are not biased by different topics. These are the 2 factors, the person sharing the message and the group in which the message was shared. We didn't find any significant results here. I'm not going to talk about them, not because we didn't have significant results, but because, frankly, I believe those manipulations didn't work very well based on data we collected. And so this is one of those where you have a piece of social science research that partly succeeds at achieving what you want and partly fails, and you learn from the failure and ask for more money and move on. We analyzed, the experiment was pre-registered. We analyzed it with ANOVAs, which means we don't control for all the possible other variables that could affect our outcomes. We use corrections because we make a number of comparisons and we don't want to risk falsely discovering something just because we're torturing the data. If people are concerned that we're just doing very simple bivariate analysis, we also did more complicated and more comprehensive regressions with all the variables that were measured and all the experimental factors in our study, but we found exactly the same results. So for ease of presentation, I report the pre-registered analyses, which are based on ANOVAs. So the treatments, what did people see? They could see a mock-up, first they saw some text, which I'm not going to comment on because this was the part where we, for example, say, imagine that a friend of yours has posted this, versus imagine that a member of your family has posted this. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not the focus of the presentation today. The key point is that people could see either a message with or without a source. And the source was presented as being the BBC News. We put the logo in there. We put a link in there. People couldn't click on that link. And we put the address of the website, which corresponded to the way in which WhatsApp at the time would show messages that included a link to users. Crucially, the message could be true or false. And in the case of climate change, there is a true fact that the temperatures on the Earth are predicted to drop by a little bit because of natural phenomena, but there is also a very widely circulating hoax that we found on fact-checker websites that says that that decrease is not going to be 0.1 or 0.2 degrees, but 1 or 2 degrees, which would be lovely because then we wouldn't have to worry about our lives being destroyed by climate change, but unfortunately not true. So basically what we're trying to see here is whether seeing a true versus a false statement makes a difference, and whether seeing a true or false statement accompanied by a BBC News attribution or not accompanied by that attribution makes a difference. So, what do we find? As I mentioned, we have 6 dependent variables, so I'm going to show you condensed presentations of results, and I'm going to try to make them, to build a narrative around them. So here, our first hypothesis is that having something attributed to the BBC News will make it generally more credible. Yes, we find that. We also find that people are more likely to stay silent when they see a message that is attributed to the BBC. So they're like, there's nothing else to say here, it's fine. And they are less likely to ask for additional information. Okay, so again, I don't need to know anything else. It's from the BBC, it's fine. The other outcomes we're interested in, we found results in the direction we expected, but they were not significant. So, not enough, the effect was not powerful enough for it to stand out. Did people react differently to true versus false messages? Yes, to some degree. They found that the true messages, 0.1 degrees versus 1 or 2 degrees, was more likely to be true by a bit, enough to be significant, but not a huge difference. And importantly, nothing else stood out in terms of the other outcomes we saw. So, you remember I said earlier, if somebody shares something that is false in a chat you're part of, you could be the one that debunks it. Well, we are finding that people are not going to be the ones debunking it. Okay? Even if people believed that the false statements were false, more false than the true statements, and the true statements more true than the false statements, they were not equally as likely to react, at least in the context of our experiment, which was, we were asking them to imagine a situation. They were not in the situation. If this was not clear, this was not a simulated environment where people were interacting with other people. They were just interacting with a survey interface. Still, we asked them, what would you do? What do you think you would do? And they didn't tell us that they were more likely to correct false information that they saw on these, if they had seen that false information in a WhatsApp conversation. Finally, a third hypothesis where we need to compare true and false and with or without the source. And as you can see here, nothing much is happening. So none of these estimates differ significantly from each other. It all seems to be a bit of a wash. So what does that mean? Well, it's a null finding, right? So you could say, it's a null finding. We don't find support for our hypothesis. Yes, but it's a null finding that we believe is quite important. And to emphasize this, I'm going to zoom in on the perceived message credibility. Okay? So this is the bigger version of the top left chart. How credible did people think these messages were, depending on whether they had been attributed to the BBC or not, and whether they were true or false. Now, let's look at them one by one. First one. So, a true message without a source is pretty credible. More credible than a false message without a source. Okay? So, people were more likely to say that the temperatures were going to think that it was true that the temperatures are going to rise by only 0.1 to 0.2 than 1 or 2 degrees. Okay, so far so good. Thank you. What happens when there is a false message attributed to the BBC? Well, that false message is essentially statistically as credible as the true message without attribution. What happens when there is a true message attributed to the BBC? Well, it is more credible than all the others, right? But statistically, these are error bars. It's just as credible as the false message attributed to the BBC. And that false message, as I mentioned earlier, was just as credible as the true message without attribution. So let's put this all together. These are all the results. Well, essentially, statistically, there is no difference between the true messages with or without source attribution, the false message and the false message with source attribution. The only odd one out, the only one that is statistically distinguishable, and not by much, granted, is the message without a source that is false. So, what does this mean? Well, it means that the BBC logo and the BBC attribution boosted the credibility of both true and false messages in the same way. And by doing that, it completely eliminated people's ability to discern between true and false messages. People reacted to the true and false message attributed by the BBC in the same way. So deceptive source misattribution can work. People can fall for misinformation if it's attributed to a reputable source. Our second finding is that source attribution has effects not only on credibility of the information, but also on some intended behaviors, and also these intended behaviors that we measured that were relevant to personal messaging. And finally, another finding that I paused upon to comment upon a minute ago that is a little concerning is that yes, people are likely to say that true information is more accurate than false information, but are not likely to act upon this in the context of personal messaging. And as I mentioned a few times, this is important because we can't rely on automated algorithmic moderation to protect us against misinformation on these encrypted apps. So there's a lot of limitations to this project. We only focused on WhatsApp. We don't know if the results would generalize. We had a simulated environment, not a real interface where people could interact, and people interacted with imaginary others, not with the people they actually talked to in real life. We focused on a single country that happens to have a very trusted public service media. That doesn't always happen, and also if we had maybe used other sources, if you had used the Sun or the Times instead of the BBC, we would have probably had different results, and there's a need for more research on that. We only focused on 2 news topics. We don't know what would have happened if we had focused on, for example, foreign policy. We relied on self-reports. We asked people, what would you do? And we know that people are, to some degree guessing when they are answering these kinds of questions. We relied on single measures for these outcomes, and there's good reason to use multiple measures if you can. We thought this was not worth it because the survey was already long and we didn't want to overburden our participants. And even though, I've told you, we found these effects, comparatively speaking, these effects are on the low end of the spectrum in terms of their size. It's not like a blowout. The most interesting thing is actually the lack of difference between messages that are true and false attributed to the BBC. We didn't find, a silver bullet. We found that things get muddy and complex. But that in itself, we think, is important. So what do we take from this? And this is my last slide. We think that digital platforms really need to do something about deceptive source misattribution. We know that the policy climate has changed quite radically in the past few weeks, which means that policymakers perhaps should step up. For one, they should support public service media, especially when they see their credibility weaponized and exploited by malicious users, but perhaps also in being a little more forthcoming in regulating at least some aspects of these environments. For news organizations, on the one hand, it's very good to know that their brand can be so powerful. On the other hand, if their brand is appropriated by malicious users, it can have really damaging effects. And finally, for us researchers, we are scholars in political communication. We know that source credibility has been a very important feature of why people believe what they do in contemporary media environments. What we have hoped to accomplish with this project is to show that source credibility can also be misappropriated. It's not just a matter of, people are going to believe the BBC more than a random website when they tell the truth, but people are also going to believe the BBC when its brand is appropriated to tell to tell lies or to exaggerate. And also we have looked at a field that at a kind of platforms that has not really been researched extensively, which is personal messaging apps, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, was the key motivation for our project. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Cristian. Perfect timing. So, open the floor to questions, Cristian.
That was fascinating, thank you. Just a quick question. So you chose to use climate change as an example, and obviously that's a topic where people have very strong preconceived opinions. Mm-hmm. So why did you decide not to check what their attitude was climate change was prior to the experiment?
Thanks for the question. We did check that. So one of the many slides I could have shown is that we ran probably 100 exploratory analyses looking at differential effects, where we asked, for example, are people's opinions on climate change? We measure both whether they believed climate change was caused by humans or not, and how important they thought it was. And then we look at whether those previous attitudes moderated the effects of the treatments. They didn't. So even though obviously the people who cared more about climate change were more likely to say that it was true, that it was going to be a small decrease in the temperatures, and the people who are more skeptical about climate change were more likely to say it was true that the decline in the temperatures would be 1 to 2 degrees. The impact of our treatments did not change between, among those groups, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding the presentation of the false information. Do you mind go back to the slide, please?
Which one?
About the true and false information example with
Sure.
BBC News on it.
Sure. Here.
One thing I've noticed is that the link presented below, they all go to bbc.co.uk, which is owned by the BBC. However, in real misinformation efforts, the domain is likely to be something like bbc/news.uk. So is it possible that people who have participated in this study previously have relevant, let's say, caution from somewhere saying about you need to look out for if the domain is correct, but if the domain are both correct, that might have affected their decisions?
Thank you. That's a very good point. I would say this is probably something that if I could go back, I would change. It also came up in some of the peer reviews, so it's something that we've been thinking about. I would say two things. One, you're probably right that if we, it's an empirical question, but if we had used something like a similar but not correct URL, the results might have been a little different. However, in terms of realism, I would say if I was somebody aiming to spread misinformation on WhatsApp, I would actually want to do something like this, using a screenshot instead of sharing an actual link, knowing that most people don't click on these links, right? So I think there could be perhaps a bifurcated outcome. One would be in the real world, if this had been an actual link to a BBC article, that article would have not said that the temperatures will drop by 2 degrees. The people clicking on it would have been exposed to accurate information. However, I would imagine that most people would not click on that link because the way we use WhatsApp is not really that we spend a lot of time clicking on everything. I mean, my parents send me a lot of stuff I don't click on. And so for those people, actually, this could be a trick they could fall for. But it's a very good point and one that we've been thinking about. Ideally, we would have not just changed attribution to a news source, but also changed the ways in which that attribution is manifested. So for example, it could have been, some people sometimes will share information. One way in which you can do deceptive source misattribution is just say, the BBC just reported that, and not provide a link. People do that, right? Some of my friends in my chats, they copy and paste stuff without telling me what the source is. It's usually about football, so doesn't really matter that it's true or false. But it is a way to spread information and attribute it to a source. So it could have been just a textual attribution, could have been just the image, could have been just a link, and it could have been one of those dubious links, and then we could have been able to test whether people paid attention to the fact that the link was dubious. So there were a number of ways. I think here we had a bit of a kitchen sink approach where we tried to throw everything at our participants in terms of making them believe that this comes from the BBC, and some of it might be more applicable and realistic than some of these may be more applicable and realistic than others. Thank you.
Hi, fantastic talk. I can see how important this is for things like knowledge about climate change, things like that. Your example was true or false in binary terms. It's either true or it's false. If I receive a message that says Arnold Schwarzenegger is dead, that's either true or it's false. But I think a lot of messages are a little bit not clearly as true or false. You know, I'd have to actually do some research, and so I'm less likely to challenge it. So I just wondered if you might be looking into things like that once you.
Thank you. That's a very important question, and one on which misinformation researchers they're grappling with it. There's actually a very good article by Letitia Bode and Emily Vraga that talk about exactly this, and how what we say is true or false depends on consensus among experts. That consensus, A, might change over time, and B, is not always rock solid. You could say, are humans contributing to climate change? 99.9% yes among experts, but other, what is the impact of sanctions on Russia on inflation in Britain? Estimates can have, very huge confidence intervals, right? So I think we chose, so here we chose a contrast that is quite stark, right? It is unlikely that the truth is in the middle here. It is true that this is a technical point. One comment I got at a conference, which I was like, oh damn, you're right, is that people are very bad at numeracy, unfortunately. And so misinformation that focuses on numbers can be, how people process that can be muddied by their numerical illiteracy, which we didn't measure in the experiment, by the way. So, this colleague was like, never use these kinds of numerical comparisons. Look at something that is more verbal and doesn't require people to do math, which, again, one of the things I hopefully will do in the future. I think for issues that are more borderline, like the infamous, we had a grant application which didn't get funded, and one of the reviewers wasn't happy that we mentioned the infamous 350 million pounds to the NHS Brexit buzz slogan, right? And to this day, you can find people saying, oh, but that was not true, but also it had some truth in it, right? And you could say the most vicious misinformation is the one that has a kernel of truth, but then uses it to make a point that is extrapolated, exaggerated, or just a red herring. I think misinformation research struggles with that in general when using these kinds of methods, because here you have to, if you want to look at differences between truth and false, you need to go for more clear-cut distinctions, right? The kinds of distinctions, like even when you look at what you normally do to source that information is you go to fact-checker websites, because you want something that is realistic, that is being circulated, that people might even have seen. But fact-checker websites, sometimes they tell you this is true, this is false. Other times they tell you it's a bit of both. And we as researchers don't look at those, don't use those for experiments, because then what do you do with them? There is qualitative research, including some we have done, that actually shows very interestingly how people sometimes draw boundaries very differently than fact checkers and academics. They could say, maybe not for this, but for things like, for example, how many immigrants are there in a country? Again, numerical, problems, but it's not true that there are 3 million more immigrants this year than last year, as this, right-wing website has spread. Yes, it's not true, but I still think there's too many, right? And where are we here? This person might actually have an accurate belief, but they might still extrapolate something from that is exaggerated, but it's also their opinion. So I think there are difficult balances to strike when we're looking at the end of the day, misinformation in politics is mostly shared to propagate certain political opinions. It's not, people don't care if, a climate change analyst doesn't particularly care that the people who see this message remember 1 or 2 degrees versus 0.1, 0.2 degrees. They care that those people will say, oh yeah, climate change will sort itself out. We don't need to do all these things. And so I think this is I think, the next step that misinformation research needs to take, to be honest, which is, okay, but does it matter? There is a paper that I like about Donald Trump in 2016, where the analysis shows that people didn't necessarily believe some of the misinformation, the disinformation that Trump spread in that campaign, but they ended up still agreeing with him on the substance. And so the title of the paper is Treating Trump Seriously, Not Literally, right? So instead of saying, oh yeah, it's true that there are 30 million Mexican undocumented immigrants, but they will still believe that I would like less Mexican undocumented immigrants, right? I don't know if I answered your question, but I think your question is super important in terms of how we think about these issues in a way that is more encompassing and more holistic than, than the simple binary categorizations that we tend to use.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I could ask a question, Cristian, if I can.
Yes.
Kind of two related questions following up on this. Thinking about, in terms of what is most significant overall for the effects of misinformation. So one question would be, increasingly people are arguing that out and out false information like this is not the problem. It's true information, quite often from real sources like the BBC, that is used in a misleading context.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any data on that question of, well, what actually matters more, what's more influential, kind of fabricated or deceptive source manipulation information like that versus this other kind of more, other category of misleading information? And then the kind of parallel question is, what's more influential in terms of the spread of misinformation? Is it deceptive source manipulation on private messaging or on social media? Is there a difference between the two?
Thanks, Peter. I think on the second one, it's easier to answer because there's not been a whole lot of research that looks at this. So funnily enough, and if people are interested in the paper, feel free to email me and I'll send you a copy. It's under review, so I'm not just we're not putting it out there in public, but I'm happy to share a copy. We reviewed very carefully all the research on source, credibility, and disinformation, and basically nobody has done what we are doing, which is not rocket science, but it's simply showing people, both true and false information from attributed or not attributed to the same source. People have either only shown people information actually published by the source, so this would be, or they've shown people false information attributed to a source. This would be this. They have not done the two. I don't know why. Maybe our idea was really bad and that's why no one else has done it, or maybe we had a good idea that people hadn't thought about. The other thing, there is a lot of research on social media and a lot less on personal messaging for the reasons I discussed. My best guess would be that if people did a similar piece of research where their mock-ups were Facebook or Instagram versus WhatsApp, they would find something very similar. The big problem here is that the limitation of this kind of work is that we are not doing a field experiment. We are not giving people a discussion platform, or we're not asking them to join a WhatsApp group where we artificially inject this information. This would be very nice to do, and actually we have a grant application where we hope to do something similar, although not in the context of misinformation. It's also ethically much more complicated than a simple one-shot, online experiment. So it might be that, if you just change the mock-up and tell people, oh, this is a Facebook post rather than WhatsApp, I would imagine you would find something rather similar, because there's a bit of a leap between looking at the mock-up and thinking, oh yeah, this could be on my WhatsApp phone, and actually being on your WhatsApp phone. So I think partly this speaks to the limitations of this kind of research in the social sciences. In terms of but I would expect the results to be similar based on the literature and based on what we know about source attribution on social media. In terms of your first question, I think that is a very good question, and one that people, at least in my neck of the academic woods, don't look at as often. But I think it is very, very important. Information is not usually accessed out of context, right? It's always part of narratives. It's contextualized, right? So you could say, oh yeah, the BBC has said that these factors are causing inflation, but it might be that the BBC has also said that the role of other factors is much bigger, right? And then you could seize upon that little piece of information and take it out of context. I don't know research of this kind that has looked at this so precisely. I think the two questions are nicely connected indeed. I think we as a field have taken a rather simplistic approach to these topics, partly I think because after 2016, there was such a rush to really try to disentangle, are we really, completely screwed? Are we really completely in a post-truth society where people are going to believe that the Pope endorses Trump? And I think that has been a bit of a low-hanging fruit that we have, all been sort of like hanging on to for perhaps a bit too long. And I think we should look at these more subtle forms of misinformation and disinformation. Thank you.
One final question.
Thank you. Coming back to climate change and big topics like that, I mean, I'm just interested, so my personal impression is that with these kind of topics, it's very, very difficult to get people to change their mind.
Yes.
So in a way, one of the surprising results in your research is that people change their mind. So do you think that's to do with some parts of your setup? Do you think this might have to do with how you chose the participants? Why did you actually get people to change their mind?
Well, participants are, with the limitations of an online survey based on an opt-in sample, they resemble the general population in terms of age, gender, income, education, and region. And they're WhatsApp users, which 80% of the adult, the population online are. So I don't think it's the participants. What my best guess would be, so first of all, we didn't ask them as an outcome, do you think climate change is caused by humans or not? We didn't even try to change their attitudes towards climate change. But what we did, somewhat change in the short run is their belief that the Earth temperature would drop by 0.1, 0.2, or 1 or 2. And that, to the extent that that could lead, if sustained, to attitude change, that would be quite significant. These treatments were randomly assigned, and we checked everything, and we are absolutely sure that there's no bias in the groups that got different treatments. These were entirely evenly distributed in terms of, for example, opinions of climate change. So you were equally as likely to get one of these 4 treatments regardless of your opinion on climate change. What I think happened is what happens in most single-shot experiments. People are primed by the information they see. They see information to which they attribute some higher or lower credibility. And if 5 minutes later they're asked a question, they tend to remember that judgment they had in the short term. For this to be a stable attitude change, you would need constant repetition. Like we know from research by Lisa Fazio and others in psychology that whether the information is true or not, people forget all the time. We know that when we teach children or students, right, you need to repeat, and people need, I think, 8 or 9 repetitions of a piece of information every day to still remember it after day 1, from day 1 to day 10. So even though this could be, in a way, this would look like a strong effect, it is not a strong effect in comparative terms. Like if you look at the effect size ratios for communication research, our effects are on the lower end of what the literature tells us communication effects are. And I would imagine these effects would be quite short-lived. Not only because we debrief people, and so if we show them that the Earth is declining by 2 degrees, the temperature is declining by 2 degrees, no, this is not true. So I would really hope nobody came out of the experiment thinking that. At least we tried. But also, how much information people are exposed to every day, and how much do they remember the day after? Most research tells us very, very little, unless it's constantly repeated, and also unless it has direct relevance to their day-to-day lives, which this one does, but is not the same as, inflation has gone down by 2 points, and then the day after you go to the supermarket and you see that inflation hasn't gone down, right? This one is a projection. It's also, the differences are very meaningful in terms of the science and the systemic effects. But, today is a lovely sunny day, but yesterday it was cold. And, I'm sure you know a lot more about me, about how people make sense of, connect the issue of climate change with, weather events and the weather in ways that are probably a little bizarre sometimes and not very systematic, depending also on their pre-existing, on their priors. But I would expect these effects to not be lasting. However, if we banged on for once a day for 10 days, then after 10 days you might get people to solidify that information a little more. Thank you.
So before I come back over to Kitty, just to wrap things up, join me in thanking Cristian for speaking.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Right, everyone, just one more request from me. If you enjoyed today's seminar, I would be incredibly grateful if you could give us some feedback. This will help us shape, our future events, let us know what kind of topics you're interested in or what kind of activities you're also interested in. So yeah, please do scan that and let us know your thoughts.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
So, just see if people have questions, but do you want to go for a coffee or a drink?
Sure. What if you have time? Yeah.